I was able to see simultaneously what was being told to the Soviets to their faces and what the US was telling itself in the back room.
I'm Lynn-Jones. I edit the quarterly journal International Security, which is based here at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. Today I'm talking to Joshua Itzkowitz Shifrinson, who's an assistant professor in the Department of International Affairs at the George Bush School at Texas A&M University. And Josh is also a fellow at the Dickey Center at Dartmouth College. Josh is the author of an article that appears in the spring 2016 issue of International Security. It's called Deal or No Deal: The End of the Cold War and the U.S. Offer to Limit NATO Expansion. This article is now available not only in the print edition of the spring 2016 issue, but it's also online at the International Security website. Thanks so much for being with us today. Your article looks at some negotiations that occurred back at the end of the Cold War. Can you just refresh our memories a little bit on what was at stake in those talks and who was involved?
Sure. So the end of the Cold War involved a negotiation, on the one hand, between the U.S. and the USSR, as well as the policymakers leading East and West Germany, Britain, France, and other countries in Europe. And it involved the question of whether Germany, which had been divided throughout the Cold War, would reunify under Western auspices within NATO or under Soviet auspices within the Warsaw Pact, or go neutral entirely.
So what's the central argument that you make in your article?
The central argument I make is, on the one hand, these negotiations over the fate of Germany at the end of the Cold War involved a U.S. offer, an implicit offer, to the Soviet Union, that if the Soviet Union allowed Germany to reunify within NATO, then after reunification, NATO would not expand further eastward, that is, further into Eastern Europe and form a member to the Warsaw Pact towards the Soviet Union's borders. At the same time, just as that implicit offer was being made to the Soviet Union, the U.S. behind the scenes in its own narrative had every intention of expanding NATO further eastward, or at least creating the opportunity so that if it decided to do so in the future, it could.
And I wonder if you could tell us about the key evidence that supports your claim.
I spent approximately 3 or 4 months cumulatively in the George Bush Library, combing through National Security Council records and State Department and Defense Department records that are in the archives. And so I was able to see simultaneously what was being told to the Soviets to their faces and what the U.S. was telling itself in the back room.
Now, when the various participants in these negotiations look back, how do they interpret what happened back in 1990?
Many of the Russians actually claim very openly, Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet president, Boris Yeltsin, Russian president, Vladimir Putin, president, prime minister, and president of Russia, have repeatedly claimed that an informal non-expansion pledge was offered by the U.S. in 1990. And for the last 25 years, Western policymakers, at least in the U.S., have roundly said, no, we didn't, and nothing was written down and it wasn't signed, so it doesn't matter if it did. And what I found is that the Russian narrative is basically exactly what happened.
Does that somehow excuse Russia's behavior in, for example, Ukraine or Crimea?
No, absolutely not. There's no reason that Russia should be supporting supporting fighters in Ukraine, invading Georgia, all those gesticulating against the Baltic states. What it does do is explain how we got to this situation and highlight pathways forward.
Tell me, what do you think of what the United States and NATO are doing now vis-a-vis Russia to respond to a Russian military challenge? And would you do anything differently in light of what you found about what happened back in 1990?
Current U.S. policy, current NATO policy in Eastern Europe is the worst of all worlds. It's expansionist enough and involves force deployment sufficient to antagonize Russia, and yet militarily it's totally insignificant. There's no way that 4 battalions are going to defend the Baltic states, for example. I think these troop deployments that we're talking about today are a terrible idea. I think longer term, we need to credibly commit to forego further NATO expansion, work to repair relations with Russia, and then finally accept that the Russian narrative might have some validity to this, just as a way of signaling that the West understands where Russia is coming from and values improved relations with Russia.
What do you think your findings suggest for how we understand international relations?
Many theories have come out of the end of the Cold War U.S.-Soviet dialogue as showcasing how great powers can cooperate with each other. Scholars talk about institutions, talk about trust building, who talk about overcoming security dilemmas. But if in fact the U.S. was publicly cooperating, yet privately sharpening its knives to carve up the Russian carcass or the Soviet carcass, then we really need to revisit many of those theories.
We're unfortunately just about out of time for today. So I'd like to thank you again, Josh, for being with us. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Josh Itzkowitz Shifrinson is an assistant professor in the Department of International Affairs at the George Bush School at Texas A&M University, and he's also currently a fellow at the Dickey Center at Dartmouth. Josh is the author of an article called Deal or No Deal: The End of the Cold War and the U.S. Offer to Limit NATO Expansion. It appears in the spring 2016 issue of International Security, and a shorter version is published in the Los Angeles Times as an op-ed, and you can read either online. Thank you again, Josh, for being with us today.
Thank you, Sean, for having me.